Behind every smile, every anniversary, and every shared memory, there's a story, sometimes one filled with love, sometimes one drenched in betrayal. But what happens when the person you trust the most shatters that bond? What happens when the truth comes crashing down, in the most unexpected place, at the most unexpected moment? Quick flashes of Helen and Richard's life together, wedding photos, family vacations, before cutting to a shot of Helen standing still, eyes filled with quiet resolve. Tonight, we dive into the shocking true story of Helen Monroe, a woman who thought she knew her husband until the day everything changed. At a party meant to celebrate a milestone, Helen did the unthinkable, exposing her husband's betrayal in front of friends, family, and colleagues. But why? And how did it all unfold? This is a story of love, trust, and a heart-wrenching betrayal that no one saw coming. But it's also a story of strength, freedom, and the courage to speak the truth, no matter the consequences. Stay with us till the end, because what happens next will change the way you see love and the dark secrets that can tear even the strongest bonds apart. This is a story that you can't miss. Watch all the way to the end to fully grasp the twists, the turns, and the shocking revelation. And don't forget, your thoughts matter. Leave a comment, subscribe, and join us on this journey into the most chilling crimes of the heart. For 36 years, Helen Monroe believed she knew the man she married. Richard was her life, her anchor, the one who shared all the little things, the cups of tea, the cozy evenings, and the silent understanding that came with growing old together. She had met Richard when she was just 23. A young, bright-eyed teacher, full of dreams and ambitions, who had no idea that her life would become entwined with his. He was a quiet man, thoughtful, with a dry wit and a love for jazz that matched her own. His laugh, though rare, was warm, and when he smiled, it felt like everything in the world was right. At the time, Richard seemed to be everything Helen had ever wanted. He was stable, reliable, and perhaps most importantly, loyal. He was the kind of man who would always keep his promises, whether it was bringing her a small bouquet on their anniversary or coming home early on Saturdays to help her with the house. His presence was like a steady beat in the background of her life, a rhythm that she trusted. He was the man she built her world around. Their life, though simple, was beautiful in its own way. They didn't need grand gestures or extravagant displays of affection to show their love. They had Saturday morning pancakes, a ritual that started in their first apartment and continued into their suburban home. Every autumn, they'd go on long walks together, hand in hand, through the neighborhood's golden leaves, sharing stories, or simply walking in silence, each comfortable in the other's presence. Their annual camping trips up north were another treasured tradition. The smell of pine trees, the crackling of a campfire, and the quiet under the star-filled sky became the backdrop of their family life. It wasn't just the trips themselves, it was the way they made memories, how they carried those moments with them. The laughter around the campfire, the small talk, the shared experiences, they all became pieces of a life they had created together, a life Helen thought was built to last. They had raised 2 daughters together. Their home was modest but filled with love. There was a warm energy in their house that made it a place people wanted to visit. It wasn't about having the biggest house or the latest gadgets, it was about the warmth of family dinners, the comfort of a well-worn couch, and the shared knowledge that no matter what life threw at them, they would always have each other. Helen often found herself reflecting on those quiet moments. It was the small things that made up their life. The way Richard would help with the dishes after dinner, or the way he'd always manage to make her laugh after a long, tiring day at work. They weren't perfect, and neither was their life. There were disagreements, tough days, and challenges, like any long-term relationship. but Helen believed in the strength of their bond. It was the kind of love that was built slowly, over time, like a house made of bricks, each day adding something new, something stronger. This was the life Helen had come to cherish. It wasn't flashy or dramatic. It was dependable. It was comfortable. It was the kind of life that people worked hard to build, and they'd done just that. Over the years, their love had become a rhythm, consistent, steady, and reassuring. Helen often found herself thinking about how lucky she was to have found someone like Richard. They had created something beautiful together, side by side. But as time went on, Helen began to sense a change. She didn't know exactly when it started, but she could feel it. It was subtle at first, little things. Richard started staying late at work more often, saying he was buried in reports and didn't want to come home until they were done. He stopped listening to their favorite jazz records in the kitchen. Instead, he wore wireless earbuds, and when Helen asked about it, he shrugged it off, saying it was nothing. He started guarding his phone, too. A phone that used to sit untouched for hours on the kitchen counter now kept close to his side, face down. It was small, almost imperceptible, but Helen began to notice. She brushed it off at first, thinking it was just the stress of retirement. They'd been talking about it for months. Richard had worked at the city planning department for over 4 decades. After all that time, the idea of leaving it all behind seemed daunting. Maybe that's why he seemed a little off, a little withdrawn. It wasn't the first time Helen had seen Richard become irritable or distant. They had been married long enough to understand that sometimes life just wore you down, and retirement was a big change. She had convinced herself that it was just a phase, a rough patch. But then came the unexplained absences, trips to staff meetings that Helen didn't know about until the night before. A work dinner where Richard came home without his jacket, saying he'd left it at the restaurant. Each excuse, no matter how small, started to build up. Richard's behavior became harder to ignore. And that feeling, that gnawing feeling in the pit of Helen's stomach, grew stronger. As the days went by, Helen found herself paying closer attention to the little things. She began taking notes, tracking his comings and goings in a small notebook she kept in her nightstand. She watched the credit card statements more closely, picking up on small, suspicious charges. Dinner for 2 at a boutique restaurant. A hotel near the city. Nothing extravagant. Nothing glaringly obvious. But it was enough. Then came the fateful Saturday morning when she found the receipt. It was for coffee at a shop downtown, a place that wasn't near Richard's office. And on the back of the receipt was a name: Kayla. 10 a.m. It wasn't just any name. It was a name she didn't recognize. A name that felt out of place in their world. It wasn't someone from work, someone Helen could easily identify. It was a woman, someone Richard was meeting regularly, someone who didn't belong in their life. For years, Helen had lived in a rhythm. Their life was steady, predictable, and built on trust. But over the past year, something had shifted in Richard. It wasn't something that happened overnight. It was small, subtle changes at first, the kind of things you might brush off or dismiss as the natural ebb and flow of life. But for Helen, who had been watching him for years, these small shifts became harder to ignore. Helen began to notice Richard staying late at work more often. He had always been a dedicated employee, but now, it seemed like he was buried in reports and meetings. At first, it didn't raise any alarms. He had been working at the city planning department for decades. Perhaps, she thought, it was just the pressure of preparing for retirement. Richard had been talking about it for months, stepping away from the job he'd held for 4 decades. Maybe the stress was starting to get to him. But the late nights became more frequent. And the stories, when Helen asked him about his day, began to sound more rehearsed. A long meeting, he'd say. I'm tied up with reports, need to get this done before I leave. Helen had always trusted him, but now she couldn't help but feel that something was off. And then there was the phone. A device that had once been an afterthought, just lying around the house without a second thought, was now something Richard was constantly guarding. It was always in his pocket now, face down, or tucked away in the drawer when it wasn't in use. Whenever Helen reached for it to check something, anything, it was as if Richard became defensive. I need it for work, he'd say. That was new. Richard had never been one to hide things. Their marriage was built on trust, on honesty. But suddenly, this small device became a barrier. A symbol of something being kept from her. Another subtle change was the music. Helen remembered the mornings when Richard would play their favorite jazz records while they made breakfast together, the soft melodies filling the kitchen as they moved around each other with easy familiarity. Those mornings were comforting. Music had always been a part of their lives. It was how they had connected, even before the children came along. But now, the sound of jazz was replaced by silence, or worse, the click of wireless earbuds. Richard would wear them while making coffee, while eating breakfast, while sitting on the couch. He had his own playlist, one that Helen didn't recognize. The music they once shared was no longer part of their daily rhythm. Helen tried to tell herself it was just a phase. Retirement was coming up, and maybe it was just stress. Maybe he was overwhelmed with all the changes in their lives. But as the months went by, the little things grew bigger. They weren't just minor annoyances anymore, they were clues, signs that Richard's world was changing, and it wasn't just about retirement. Something else was going on, and Helen was beginning to sense it more and more. Then came the conference. It was a Thursday evening when Richard casually mentioned a conference in Chicago. "Oh, yeah," he said nonchalantly, "I'll be in Chicago next week for a conference." Helen's eyebrows furrowed as she tried to recall any mention of this trip before. It wasn't the way Richard usually talked about work events. Usually, he'd mention them well in advance. But now, it felt like it had been dropped into conversation at the last minute, as if it was an afterthought. Helen didn't press him, but something about it felt off. She'd learned over the years that it wasn't always about the big things, it was the small ones that could give you the most insight. And the more Helen thought about it, the more it started to feel like Richard was hiding things from her. Then, one night, after Richard came home from work, he muttered something about a work dinner. When Helen asked about it, he casually mentioned that he had left his jacket at the restaurant. "I must have forgotten it there," he said, shrugging it off. Helen didn't buy it. She had known Richard long enough to know when he was trying to cover something up. That wasn't like him, he was always meticulous about keeping track of his things. And besides, when had he ever forgotten his jacket at a restaurant? It didn't add up. But the moment of truth came the following Saturday. Helen was folding laundry when she found it. A receipt. A simple coffee shop receipt from downtown Detroit. It wasn't near Richard's office. It wasn't even a place they frequented. And on the back, scribbled in a hurried hand, was a name, Kayla. Helen froze. That name. Kayla. It wasn't a name she recognized. It was young, modern, out of place in their world. She didn't know any of Richard's co-workers with that name. and she certainly didn't recognize it from their social circle. It felt foreign, and in the pit of her stomach, a sense of dread began to creep up. Her hands shook as she folded the laundry, the weight of the receipt pressing heavily in her palm. Richard had been spending time with someone else. Someone who wasn't just a colleague. Someone who was younger, someone who wasn't a part of the life they had built together. For a moment, Helen thought about confronting him, but she didn't. She couldn't. It wasn't just about this one piece of evidence, it was the growing accumulation of little things that didn't make sense. The nights out that didn't add up, the phone tucked away in his pocket, the sudden distance between them. She had known for a while now, in the deepest parts of her heart, that something was wrong. And now, she couldn't ignore it anymore. The truth had found its way to her, and there was no turning back. It was a quiet Saturday morning when the moment of truth arrived. Helen had planned to surprise Richard with something simple, something heartfelt, a batch of homemade cookies to mark his last week at the city planning department. It was meant to be a gesture of kindness, a small treat to remind him of the family waiting for him at home, and of their shared history. For 36 years, Helen had done little things like this, making breakfast, planning their annual camping trips, sending him off to work with a smile. These were the things she did because she loved him. So, that morning, when she slipped the cookies into a small box and decided to take them to his office, she was filled with the kind of quiet joy that came from knowing her husband's retirement was finally just around the corner. She drove to his office, a familiar route, one she had taken countless times before. The city planning department was a short drive from their home, nestled in the heart of downtown Detroit. Helen had visited Richard there on occasion, dropping off lunch or just checking in during busy workdays. But this time, something felt different, something that she couldn't quite place. As she pulled into the parking lot, she noticed Richard's car was already there. That wasn't unusual, he often arrived early, especially when he had a lot to wrap up before his retirement. But as she parked and started walking toward the building, it was the sight of them that caught her off guard, the sight of Richard and Kayla, standing together just outside the cafe across the street. At first, Helen didn't understand what she was seeing. The image didn't make sense. Richard was laughing, really laughing, in a way she hadn't seen in months. And Kayla, she was leaning in toward him, her long brown hair falling in soft waves over her shoulder. The way they were standing, their proximity, the casualness with which Richard rested his hand on hers, it was clear that there was more between them than just a professional relationship. Helen felt her body go numb. The cookies, which had once felt like a small but meaningful gesture of love, suddenly felt absurd. How could she have thought everything was fine? How could she have been so blind? The man she had spent decades with, the man she had built her life around, was now standing with someone else. Someone younger, someone who seemed to fit so perfectly into the life Helen thought was only hers to share. For a moment, she stood there, frozen in place. She didn't know what to do. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't even confront them. She just stood there, watching them, until the weight of the moment sank in. Without a word, Helen turned around and walked back to her car. The cookies were still in her hands, but now they felt heavier, more like a reminder of everything she had lost. She drove home in a daze, the shock still buzzing in her chest. Her mind kept replaying the image of Richard with Kayla, and the more she thought about it, the more certain she became. All the small things she had noticed over the past year, Richard's late nights, the guarded phone, the unexplained absences, were not just coincidences. They were signs. Signs that Richard had been living a double life. Back at home, Helen didn't know what to do with herself. The house, which had always felt like a place of comfort, now felt cold, empty, even though everything was exactly where it had always been. She opened her notebook, the one she had kept hidden for months. The one where she had been documenting the small details, the things she couldn't explain but couldn't ignore. Her suspicion had been growing for weeks, but now, it was undeniable. It wasn't just a feeling anymore, it was the truth staring her in the face. There, in the pages of the notebook, were all the things she had quietly observed, the unexplained absences, the little lies Richard had told her, the receipts, the mysterious phone calls. The pattern she had feared was real. Richard had been hiding his affair with Kayla for months, perhaps longer. And the realization hit Helen harder than anything she had felt before. The man she had loved and trusted, the man she had built a life with, had betrayed her in the worst possible way. Helen ran her fingers over the last few pages, the weight of the truth pressing down on her chest. She could no longer pretend. No longer wait for Richard to come clean. He wasn't going to. The lies he had been telling her for months, maybe years, weren't just mistakes. They were choices. And now, she had to face the reality of what those choices meant for her future. She sat there for what felt like hours, just thinking. Her mind raced with questions. How long had this been going on? Was Richard truly in love with this woman? Or was she just someone to fill a void he had been ignoring for years? And what did this mean for her? For their family? For everything she thought she knew about their life? Finally, after the silence became unbearable, Helen stood up, the weight of the decision heavy on her shoulders. She walked into the living room and picked up the phone, dialing a number she had never thought she would need. She wasn't sure what she would say, but she knew one thing for certain: this was the moment she could no longer live in denial. The life she had built with Richard was over. The trust had been shattered, and it wasn't just about his betrayal. It was about her own freedom, her ability to reclaim herself, to live a life that was hers and hers alone. As soon as the truth settled in Helen's mind, the quiet routine of their life began to feel suffocating. The house she once found comforting now felt heavy with the weight of her own silence. The very thought of Richard's retirement party, something she had originally looked forward to, became the catalyst for a much-needed confrontation. For 36 years, Helen had been the loving wife, supporting Richard's career, taking care of their home, and building a life she believed was solid and unbreakable. But that life, she realized, had been a facade, a carefully constructed illusion Richard had maintained to hide his betrayal. The more Helen thought about the party, the more it felt like the perfect moment to tear that illusion down. Helen had always prided herself on her ability to manage events. She was the one who organized their family gatherings, coordinated birthdays, and handled the details without fail. Richard's retirement ceremony was no different. She had already picked the venue, a modest but elegant community hall, arranged the catering, coordinated with his co-workers, and created a slideshow to celebrate Richard's decades of service. To the outside world, it was a celebration of his life's work, his dedication, and the beginning of a well-deserved retirement. But for Helen, it had become much more than that. It was a stage. She would expose Richard's affair at the very moment he thought he was stepping into the next chapter of his life. He had been living a double life for months, lying to her, lying to their family. This wasn't just about him getting a new chapter, it was about Helen reclaiming her own story. Helen spent hours putting together the slideshow, a perfect balance of sentiment and nostalgia, with one final, deliberate twist. She didn't want to just confront Richard alone, she wanted everyone to know the truth. She wanted the people who had admired him, who had celebrated his career, to understand that all the success and accolades came at a cost. That cost was the quiet destruction of a marriage built on years of trust. She added the final slide, the one that would change everything, a candid photo of Richard and Kayla, taken just 2 weeks before the party. The image, taken from across the street, showed them sitting together outside a cafe, his hand resting on hers, a comfortable, intimate gesture that spoke volumes about their relationship. The photo wasn't perfected, wasn't posed or staged, but that made it all the more powerful. It was real. And it was the truth. As she worked on the party details, Helen's mind kept returning to the moment of truth. The moment when she would stand in front of their family, their friends, and his colleagues, and finally lay everything bare. She knew it wouldn't be easy. It wasn't about humiliating Richard, it was about releasing herself from the chains of silence, from the burden of pretending everything was fine. For too long, she had kept her feelings to herself, believing in the man she thought she knew. But now, she would no longer protect his secrets. The more Helen thought about it, the clearer it became. Richard had taken so much from her. He had taken her trust, her love, and her loyalty, and in return, he had given her lies. He had lived his life in secret, hiding behind excuses, and it was time for him to face the consequences of his actions. This party, this celebration of his retirement, would be the moment everything changed. The life they had built together, the love she thought they shared, would be exposed for what it truly was, a lie. She began preparing herself for the moment when she would reveal the truth. Helen had always been composed, the kind of person who kept her emotions in check, who didn't let others see her pain. But this time, she wasn't going to bottle it up. She wasn't going to hide behind a smile. She wasn't going to sit in the audience, quietly watching Richard bask in the admiration of everyone while the truth festered inside her. This time, Helen was going to speak up, and she was going to do it in front of everyone. The night of the retirement party arrived, and Helen was ready. She had planned every detail. The room was filled with flowers, warm light, and the sounds of laughter as Richard's colleagues and friends gathered to celebrate him. Helen moved gracefully through the crowd, offering smiles and polite conversation, all while feeling the weight of the moment pressing on her chest. But as Richard took the stage, his charm turned on full force, the familiar smile plastered on his face. Helen couldn't help but feel a sense of calm. It wasn't anger she felt. It wasn't resentment. It was something else. Something freeing. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The moment she would speak the truth. He thanked Helen, of course. He called her his rock, his support system, the one who had been there through it all. And as the words left his mouth, Helen stood there, listening, and for the first time in months, she didn't feel the weight of the years of silence. She didn't feel like a shadow in his life. She felt like someone who was finally coming into her own. When it was time for the surprise slideshow, Helen's nerves were steady. She had prepared for this moment. The memories of their life together, the good times, the laughter, the milestones they played on the screen in front of everyone. It felt like a lifetime ago. The images of their wedding, their children growing up, their vacations, those moments were real, they had meant something. And then, just as the last slide was about to fade, there it was. The photo of Richard and Kayla, sitting outside the cafe, laughing together. His hand resting on hers, a gesture that, to anyone watching, would look like a couple in love. Helen stood up slowly. She felt the eyes of the room on her, but it didn't matter. It was time. Time to stop hiding, time to stop pretending. She turned to the audience, her voice steady but filled with the weight of the years she had carried the secret. Helen's voice, calm but firm. For months now, Richard has been living a double life. While I was planning this celebration, while I organized everything, he was hiding his affair with someone half his age. Someone who meant more to him than he ever let on. Helen didn't pause. She kept going, her voice strong, full of conviction. This wasn't about revenge. This was about the truth. Helen's voice, I thought everyone here deserved to see the full picture. The night of Richard's retirement party arrived, and with it, a sense of quiet anticipation. The atmosphere was charged with the excitement of a new chapter in Richard's life, yet beneath the surface, the tension that had been building in Helen for months was palpable. She moved through the evening like any gracious hostess would, smiling, exchanging pleasantries, greeting friends and family who had gathered to celebrate Richard's career. But inside, her heart was heavy, weighed down by the secret she was about to expose. Helen watched as Richard made his way around the room. He was charming. As always, he had a way of captivating people with his words, his charisma. He was the center of attention, basking in the glow of his retirement, the culmination of 4 decades of hard work. He had earned this moment, or so everyone thought. The speeches had been made, the congratulations flowed, and the evening seemed to be going exactly as Richard had imagined it would. But for Helen, this night was nothing like what she had expected. It wasn't just a celebration. It wasn't about Richard's success. It was about something deeper, something far more personal and painful. For so many years, she had lived in the shadows of this marriage, in the silence of Richard's lies. Tonight, she would no longer be silent. When it was time for the surprise slideshow, a tribute to Richard's years of service and their shared memories, Helen stood back, watching as the images of their life together began to flicker on the screen. Photos of their wedding day, family vacations, their children growing up. The memories they had made over the years filled the room with warmth and nostalgia. The audience murmured with affection, ohing and ahhing at the photos of a family that seemed perfect on the outside. Helen, however, felt a tightness in her chest as the images played. These were the memories of a life she had believed in, a life she had worked to build, to preserve. But now, those memories felt like a facade. She had spent so many years loving a man who was hiding a secret from her. And as the slideshow continued, it was time for the truth to come out. And then, at the very end of the slideshow, just as the last images of their family faded away, there it was, the photo that would change everything. The photo of Richard and Kayla, sitting together outside a cafe. His hand resting casually on hers, a gesture of affection so intimate, so familiar, that it was undeniable. The camera had caught the moment just before they shared a quiet laugh, their faces close, their connection palpable. The room went silent. Helen's heart pounded in her chest as the shock rippled through the guests. Richard's face drained of color. He froze. For the first time in years, he was speechless. His eyes darted from the screen to Helen, to the guests who were now looking at him with confusion, disbelief, and a growing sense of betrayal. His mask had slipped, and for the first time, the truth was out in the open. Helen, standing at the front of the room, slowly stood up. Her movements were calm, deliberate. Her heart raced, but her voice remained steady. She didn't need to yell. She didn't need to shout or cry. The truth was enough. The truth had always been enough. With a steady breath, Helen turned to the crowd, her voice firm and clear, the weight of the words she had been holding inside for months finally coming to the surface. Helen's voice, strong but steady. For months now, Richard has been living a double life. while I was planning this celebration, while I worked tirelessly to honor his career, he was hiding his affair with someone half his age. Someone who meant more to him than he ever let on. Helen didn't flinch. She didn't look at Richard. She didn't need to. This moment wasn't for him. It was for her. It was for the truth. Helen's voice, even and calm, but full of conviction, "Tonight, I'm not here for revenge. I'm here to speak the truth. I am not the woman who will sit quietly while her life is turned into a lie. And I will not protect his secret any longer. The truth is here for all of you to see." Helen paused for a moment, her eyes never leaving the stunned guests, but her heart was no longer heavy. It was lighter now, freer. The burden of silence had been lifted. Helen's voice, one last time, final and resolute, "I have spent 36 years loving a man who no longer respects me. And tonight, I am finally done protecting his lies." With that, Helen turned and walked off the stage. Her heels clicked against the floor, the sound of them echoing in the silence that followed. The guests remained frozen, unsure of what to do, how to react. The shock in the room was palpable, but Helen didn't wait for their approval. She didn't need their validation. She had spoken the truth, and that was all that mattered. The days following the retirement party were filled with a strange mix of silence and noise, silence in the form of the empty house that once echoed with the shared rhythm of a married couple, and noise from the constant barrage of messages from Richard. Helen had exposed the truth, but she had yet to truly process what it meant for her. It was a surreal feeling. She had done what she had to do. She had freed herself from the lie that had built their life. But now, reality was setting in. The phone rang again. Richard's name lit up the screen. But Helen didn't answer. She couldn't. For months, she had waited for Richard to come clean, to face the truth. But now that it was out in the open, there was nothing left to say. The hurt, the betrayal, the quiet lies, all of it had been exposed. What could Richard possibly say that would change anything? His remorse, his apologies, were meaningless now. He had betrayed her trust in the most profound way. And no amount of words could undo that. Still, Richard didn't give up. His calls became desperate. Voice messages, texts pleading for a chance to speak, for a chance to explain. But Helen didn't respond. She didn't need to. The truth had already been spoken, and now she needed to focus on herself. She wasn't interested in hearing excuses or rationalizations. She wasn't interested in hearing how it just happened or he never meant for it to go this far. The damage was done. Richard had crossed a line, and no amount of regret could change that. But Helen wasn't angry. At least, not in the way one might expect. She didn't cry over Richard. She didn't scream or lash out. She cried because of the years that were lost, the years spent trusting a man who had never been fully honest with her. She cried for the dreams that would never be realized, the plans they had made for their golden years, the quiet moments they had imagined in their retirement. Those dreams were shattered, and no amount of apologizing would ever bring them back. She thought of the camping trips they had planned. The road trips, the quiet dinners, the mornings spent sipping coffee on the porch. All those years of sharing simple joys, were they a lie? Or had they been real, at least for a while? She didn't have answers, not yet. The pain of that realization still stung, but there was something else too: relief. Helen felt relief in her chest. A lightness she hadn't felt in months. This was the moment she was free. Helen knew that she was done with Richard. But she also knew that there was a long road ahead of her, one that would require healing, self-reflection, and courage. She had made the decision to let go, and that wasn't easy. It wasn't easy to walk away from someone you had spent nearly 4 decades of your life with. The weight of that decision was heavy. But it was also necessary. Later that day, she found herself standing in front of the old cedar chest in her closet, the one where they had kept all their cherished mementos, wedding albums, handwritten letters, the cards from their anniversary dinners. She ran her fingers over the smooth surface of the chest, its weight both familiar and foreign now. It was a symbol of all the years they had spent together. But now, it was also a symbol of something that was no longer hers to hold. She opened the chest slowly, almost as if she were saying goodbye to a piece of herself. She took out their wedding album, their shared journals, the anniversary cards they had exchanged so many times. For a moment, she felt a pang of nostalgia. But it wasn't about longing for what they had. It was about closure, about giving herself the space to move forward. The memories, those happy moments, the years they had spent together were real, she knew that. They had mattered. But they weren't all that defined her anymore. She had given 36 years to someone who had betrayed her. And now, it was time to let go of those memories, to create space for something new. Not out of bitterness, but out of necessity. She needed room for herself. The next morning, Helen woke early, the quiet of the house feeling more like peace than loneliness. She made herself coffee, the same way she had always done. But this morning was different. There was a sense of calm in the stillness and emptiness, yes, but not one that was filled with sadness. It was filled with possibility. The phone buzzed on the table. Another missed call from Richard. Another voice message. But this time, Helen didn't feel the urge to check it. She didn't need to hear what he had to say. The words were meaningless now. It was over. She had made the decision, and with it, she had taken control of her own life. She thought about the future, the possibility of starting anew, of reclaiming her life, her identity. She had spent so many years defined by her role as Richard's wife, as a mother, as a caretaker. But who was she now? Who could she be without the weight of betrayal around her neck? That afternoon, she called a lawyer. It was a simple step, a small but monumental one. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't seeking revenge. She wasn't trying to punish Richard. She was protecting herself. She was choosing herself. And for the first time in a long time, Helen felt a sense of peace. The decision to file for divorce wasn't easy, but it was clear. Helen had spent decades of her life alongside Richard, building a life she thought was perfect. She had been loyal, supportive, and committed to their marriage in ways that went beyond the material. But in the end, Richard's betrayal had shattered the foundation of that life, and it wasn't something she could rebuild, no matter how much she wished it were possible. Helen filed for divorce, not out of rage, not out of a need for revenge. She wasn't trying to punish Richard. In fact, there was no satisfaction in the act of divorce. It wasn't an angry outburst or a dramatic confrontation. It was an act of self-respect. She had given Richard everything: her time, her love, her trust, and he had taken it all for granted. Now, she was reclaiming what was hers, her dignity, her peace of mind, and her future. In the quiet aftermath of the retirement party and the subsequent days of silence, Helen found herself alone with her thoughts, but not in a way that felt oppressive. For the first time in months, there was no weight pressing down on her chest, no secret to hide, no truth left unsaid. The silence was hers to fill. It was a silence that didn't need to be filled with sorrow or bitterness. It was simply the calm after the storm, the stillness that comes after the truth has been spoken. She walked along the beach that afternoon, the wind brushing against her face, the scent of salt water and the sound of the waves filling her senses. For the first time in a long while, Helen felt connected to the world around her. The rhythmic crash of the waves against the shore seemed to echo her own internal rhythm, the sense of moving forward, even after everything that had happened. Life, like the tide, keeps moving. It doesn't stop for betrayal, for pain, or for regret. It keeps going, and so would she. It wasn't the end of her story, it was the beginning of a new chapter. The old chapters, those filled with lies and secrets, those were closed now. The future was wide open, full of possibilities she hadn't dared imagine while trapped in the confines of her old life. She could breathe again. She could be herself again. There was no more waiting for someone else's truth to define her. She had found her own truth, and it was one of freedom. Helen realized that while she had spent years defining herself through her role as Richard's wife, she had never truly defined herself. Now, she was beginning to understand who she was without him. She was no longer the woman who existed in the shadow of his secrets. She was the woman who had stood up for herself, who had found the courage to speak her truth, and who was now taking back control of her own life. The divorce wasn't a symbol of her defeat. It was a symbol of her strength. She had been through the hardest part, and she had survived it. And now, she could build the life she deserved, one without secrets, one without betrayal. She didn't need Richard's approval to move forward. She didn't need his presence in her life to feel whole. She was whole on her own. As she walked back from the beach, her steps lighter than they had been in months, Helen knew that her journey wasn't over, it had just begun. She was ready for what was next. The world, once full of shadows, now seemed full of light. The future was hers to shape. For the first time in years, Helen wasn't looking back. She wasn't searching for closure in the past, or waiting for someone else to change. She had changed. And now, she was moving forward with hope, with courage, and with the knowledge that she had the power to reclaim her life. What would you do if the person you loved betrayed you in front of everyone? Would you walk away, or would you stand tall, no longer hiding from the truth? Helen's journey wasn't easy, but in the end, it was one of the most courageous decisions she could make. The truth may have hurt, but it set her free. What do you think about Helen's decision? Do you agree with how she handled the betrayal, or do you believe there's another way? Let us know in the comments below. We want to hear your thoughts. Remember, this channel brings you the most dramatic, twisted, and unforgettable stories every week. Don't miss a single one. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join us for more stories that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about love, and the crimes it can create. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more true stories that reveal the courage and justice women deserve.